Hail Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes. We probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings segments. And for today's topic, we're continuing the Wars of Beleriand series with the 5th battle in those wars. In Elvish, the battle is known as the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, but most people, including me, know it as the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. Love the title. I'll put links to my videos on the other 4 battles in the description, but just to catch us up, after the glorious battle, battle number 3, the elves enjoyed a period of relative peace that lasted for about 400 years, so a fair amount of time. This is all happening in the First Age, thousands of years before the War of the Ring. All that changed in the year 455, when Morgoth unleashed a massive surprise assault on the elves in the 4th battle, the Battle of Sudden Flame. I'm told that we may even see part of that battle depicted in the Rings of Power trailer, so it's possible that the series might show us this battle in a flashback. It's a horrendous defeat for the elves, and for the men fighting on their behalf. Shortly after that battle, then High King Fingon challenges Morgoth to a one-on-one duel and is slain, leaving his son Fingon as the new king. About 10 years later, Beren and Luthien rescue a Silmaril from Morgoth's clutches, which simultaneously fills the elves with hope and causes strife due to the oath of the sons of Feanor. And now, Maedhros, eldest of the sons of Feanor, friend to King Fingon, seeing that the elves are fractured and vulnerable, is going to attempt to unify the elves the way Fingolfin did hundreds of years earlier. Fingolfin created the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, the Feast of Reuniting. Maedhros is going to attempt to regroup the elves through an alliance called the Union of Maedhros. But his name carries baggage. Silmarillion, Chapter 20. In those days, Maedhros, son of Feanor, lifted up his heart, perceiving that Morgoth was not unassailable, for the deeds of Beren and Luthien were sung in many songs throughout Beleriand. Yet Morgoth would destroy them all, one by one, if they could not again unite and make new league and common council. And he began those councils for the raising of the fortunes of the Eldar, that are called the Union of Maedhros. Yet the oath of Feanor and the evil deeds that it had wrought did injury to the design of Maedhros, and he had less aid than should have been. Orodreth would not march forth at the word of any son of Feanor, and the elves of Nargothrond trusted still to defend their hidden stronghold by secrecy and stealth. Thence came only a small company, following Gwyndor, a very valiant prince, and against the will of Orodreth he went to the Northern War, because he grieved for the loss of Gelmir, his brother, in the Dagor Bragollach. They took the badge of the house of Fingolfin and marched beneath the banners of Fingon. And they never came back, save one. From Doriath came little help, for Maedhros and his brothers, being constrained by their oath, had before sent to Thingol and reminded him with haughty words of their claim, summoning him to yield the Silmaril or become their enemy. And every day that he looked upon the Silmaril, the more he desired to keep it forever, for such was its power. Therefore he sent back the messengers with scornful words. Then Thingol fortified the marches of his realm, and went not to war, nor any out of Doriath, save Mablung and Beleg, who were unwilling to have no part in these great deeds. To them Thingol gave leave to go, so long as they served not the sons of Feanor, and they joined themselves to the host of Fingon. But Maedhros had the help of the Naugrim, both in armed force and in great store of weapons, and the smithies of Nogrod and Belegost were busy in those days. And he gathered together again all his brothers and all the people who would follow them, and the men of Bor and Ulfang were marshalled and trained for war, and they summoned yet more of their kinsfolk out of the east. Moreover, in the west, Fingon, ever the friend of Maedhros, took counsel with Húrin, and in Hithlum the Noldor and the men of the house of Hador prepared for war. In the forest of Betrayal, Halmir, lord of the people of Halath, gathered his men, and they whetted their axes. But Halmir died ere the war came, and Haldir, his son, ruled that people. And to Gondolin also the tidings came, to Turgon, the hidden king. So there's quite a bit of valuable information in that passage, but arguably the most important sentence gets included almost as a throwaway line. You could easily overlook it, but this sentence is going to be very relevant in a few minutes. He, Gwyndor, went to the Northern War because he grieved for the loss of Gelmir, his brother, in the Dagor Bragollach. That motivation is going to add a bunch of tears to our unnumbered tears. Gwyndor is also the only elf of his group to return to Nargothrond. As the passage somewhat depressingly states, they never came back, save one. Gwyndor. But the more obvious takeaway from this text is that no one trusts the sons of Feanor, except Fingon and the dwarves, the Naugrim. Note that Maedhros trains the Easterlings, the men of Bor and Ulfang. This is also going to add to that bucket of tears, because we're given some background on those families earlier in the Silmarillion. Chapter 18. But Maedhros, knowing the weakness of the Noldor and the Edain, whereas the pits of Angband seemed to hold store inexhaustible and ever renewed, made alliance with these new-come men, and gave his friendship to the greatest of their chieftains, Bor and Ulfang. And Morgoth was well content, for this was as he had designed. The sons of Bor were Borlad, Borlach, and Borthand, and they followed Maedhros and Maglor, and cheated the hope of Morgoth, and were faithful. The sons of Ulfang the Black were Ulfast and Ulvarth, and Uldor the Accursed, and they followed Caranthir, and swore allegiance to him, and proved faithless. Hence, the union of Maedhros has been betrayed. Morgoth has double agents on the inside, and he will use them to great effect. Maedhros is unfortunately unaware of that, so he decides this is as good as it's going to get, and on a midsummer's day in 472 of the First Age, he puts his plan into action. The next few quotes are all going to be from chapter 20. But Maedhros made trial of his strength too soon, ere his plans were full wrought. And though the orcs were driven out of all the northward regions of Beleriand, and even Dorthonion was freed for a while, Morgoth was warned of the uprising of the Eldar and the elf friends, and took counsel against them. Many spies and workers of treason he sent forth among them, as he was the better able now to do, for the faithless men of his secret alliance were yet deep in the secrets of the sons of Feanor. At length, Maedhros, having gathered all the strength that he could of elves and men and dwarves, resolved to assault Angband from east and west, and he purposed to march with banners displayed in open force over Anfauglith. But when he had drawn forth, as he hoped, the armies of Morgoth in answer, then Fingon should issue forth from the passes of Hithlum, and thus they thought to take the might of Morgoth as between anvil and hammer, and break it to pieces. And the signal for this was to be the firing of a great beacon in Dorthonion. On the appointed day, on the morning of midsummer, the trumpets of the Eldar greeted the rising of the sun, and in the east was raised the standard of the sons of Feanor, and in the west the standard of Fingon, High King of the Noldor. Then Fingon looked out from the walls of Ithelsirion, and his host was arrayed in the valleys and in the woods beyond the east of Eredwethrin, well hid from the eyes of the enemy. But he knew that it was very great. For there all the Noldor of Hithlum were assembled, together with elves of the Fallas, and Gwyndor's company from Nargothrond. And he had great strength of men. Upon the right were the host of Dorlomin, and all the valor of Húrin and Huor his brother. And to them had come Haldir of Brethil, with many men of the woods. So, as Gandalf would say, the board is set, the pieces are moving. The strategy is for Maedhros' forces, including the dwarves and the Easterlings, to lure Morgoth's army out to a fight in the large barren plains of Anfauglith. And then, when the beacon is lit, the massive hidden army of Fingon, featuring elves and men from various regions, would launch a surprise assault from the west, thus crushing Morgoth's army between them. We'll meet in the middle. But first, Morgoth has to take the bait. Then Fingon looked towards Thangorodrim, and there was a dark cloud about it, and a black smoke went up. And he knew that the wrath of Morgoth was aroused, and that their challenge was accepted. A shadow of doubt fell upon Fingon's heart, and he looked eastwards, seeking if he might, with elven sight, the dust of Anfauglith rising beneath the hosts of Maedhros. He knew not that Maedhros was hindered in his setting forth by the guile of Uldor the Accursed, who deceived him with false warnings of assault from Angband. But now a cry went up, passing up the wind from the south from vale to vale, and elves and men lifted their voice in wonder and joy. For unsummoned and unlooked for, Turgon had opened the leaguer of Gondolin, and was come with an army 10,000 strong, with bright mail and long swords, and spears like a forest. Then when Fingon heard afar the great trumpet of Turgon his brother, the shadow passed, and his heart was uplifted, and he shouted aloud, "The day has come! Behold, people of the Eldar and fathers of men, the day has come!" And all those who heard his great voice echo in the hills answered, crying, "The night is passing!" So Morgoth has answered Maedhros' challenge, and Fingon is nervously waiting for the signal. We learn that one of Morgoth's spies, Uldor the Accursed, has delayed Maedhros' army in order to benefit his true master. Now, Uldor means ugly lord, so I think we can assume Uldor the Accursed was a name he got after this battle. Otherwise, no wonder he sided with Morgoth. "Hey, cursed ugly lord, what news do you bring of the enemy troops?" "Well, my name's Jerry, but thanks for the unnecessary insult. I've decided to betray you." Already, we're seeing that the plan is not coming to fruition. But then, we end the passage with a sign of hope. Turgon has come from Gondolin with 10,000 elves. And here's one of the few instances where we get a troop number. If Turgon's troops number 10,000, I think we can assume that both Fingon and Maedhros likely have armies in the tens of thousands. I doubt the good guys total over 100,000 strong, whereas the total number of orcs probably is over 100,000. And now Morgoth sends a portion of his army out towards Fingon's lines. Now Morgoth, who knew much of what was done and designed by his enemies, chose his hour, and trusting in his treacherous servants to hold back Maedhros and prevent the union of his foes, he sent a force seeming great, and yet but part of all that he had made ready, towards Hithlum, and they were clad all in dun raiment, and showed no naked steel, and thus were already far over the sands of Anfauglith before their approach was seen. Then the hearts of the Noldor grew hot, and their captains wished to assail their foes upon the plain. But Húrin spoke against it, and bade them beware of the guile of Morgoth, whose strength was always greater than it seemed, and his purpose other than he revealed. And though the signal of the approach of Maedhros came not, and the host grew impatient, Húrin urged them still to await it, and to let the orcs break themselves in assault upon the hills. But the captain of Morgoth in the west had been commanded to draw out Fingon swiftly from his hills by whatever means he could. He marched on, therefore, until the front of his battle was drawn up before the stream of Sirion, and the outposts of Fingon could see the eyes of their enemies. But there was no answer to his challenge, and the taunts of the orcs faltered as they looked upon the silent walls and the hidden threat of the hills. So Morgoth has distracted Maedhros with false troop movement reports, and he has now sent a force to lure Fingon's army out of its hidden defensive position. The fact that Morgoth knows about Fingon's forces should probably tell them the gig is up on this attack plan. And to Húrin's credit, he sniffs out a trap, advising to hold their high ground until Maedhros gives the signal. But this captain of Morgoth is motivated, probably by fear of death, and so he tries something drastic to lure out the good guys. And here's where that seemingly innocuous quote about Gwyndor comes into play. Then the captain of Morgoth sent out riders with tokens of parley, and they rode up before the outworks of the Berid Ithel. With them they brought Gelmir, that lord of Nargothrond whom they had captured in the Bragalach, and they had blinded him. Then the heralds of Angband showed him forth, crying, "We have many more such at home, but you must make haste if you would find them, for we shall deal with them all when we return, even so." And they hewed off Gelmir's hands and feet, and his head last, within sight of the elves, and left him. By ill chance, at that place in the outworks stood Gwyndor of Nargothrond, the brother of Gelmir. Now his wrath was kindled to madness, and he leapt forth on horseback, many riders with him, and they pursued the heralds and slew them, and drove on deep into the main host. And seeing this, all the host of the Noldor was set on fire, and Fingon put on his white helm and sounded his trumpets, and all the hosts of Hithlum leapt forth from the hills in sudden onslaught. The light of the drawing of the swords of the Noldor was like a fire in a field of reeds, and so fell and swift was their onset that almost the designs of Morgoth went astray. Before the army that he sent westward could be strengthened, it was swept away, and the banners of Fingon passed over Anfauglith and were raised before the walls of Angband. Ever in the forefront of that battle went Gwyndor and the elves of Nargothrond, and even now they could not be restrained, and they burst through the gate and slew the guards upon the very stairs of Angband, and Morgoth trembled upon his deep throne, hearing them beat upon his doors. But they were trapped there, and all were slain, save Gwyndor only, whom they took alive. For Fingon could not come to their aid. By many secret doors in Thangorodrim, Morgoth had let issue forth his main host that he held in waiting, and Fingon was beaten back with great loss from those walls. So Gwyndor learns that his brother was not killed in the Battle of Sudden Flame, he was captured. And he's just witnessed his brother's brutal, violent, public execution. And that's the bait that makes the good guys charge. I love the description of the light of so many swords being drawn at once, looking like a fire in a field of reeds. It's gorgeous imagery. And here, Gwyndor and the elves of Nargothrond outrun their coverage, much like Feanor did back in the day. Burst through the gates, run up the stairs to Morgoth's throne room, start banging on the doors. They give Morgoth a scare, but inevitably, the large force he had hidden is revealed, and all of the Nargothrond elves, except Gwyndor, are killed. And now Fingon's army is dropping like flies. The rout is on. Then in the plain of Anfauglith, on the 4th day of the war, there began Nirnaeth Arnoediad, Unnumbered Tears, for no song or tale can contain all its grief. The host of Fingon retreated over the sands, and Haldir, lord of the Halidin, was slain in the rearguard. With him fell most of the men of Brethil, and never came back to their woods. But on the 5th day, as night fell, and they were still afar from Eredwethrin, the orcs surrounded the host of Hithlum, and they fought until day, pressed ever closer. In the morning came hope, when the horns of Turgon were heard as he marched up with the main host of Gondolin, for they had been stationed southward guarding the pass of Sirion, and Turgon restrained most of his people from the rash onslaught. Now he hastened to the aid of his brother, and the Gondolindrim were strong and clad in mail, and their ranks shone like a river of steel in the sun. Now the phalanx of the guard of the king broke through the ranks of the orcs, and Turgon hewed his way to the side of his brother. And it is told that the meeting of Turgon with Húrin, who stood beside Fingon, was glad in the midst of battle. Then hope was renewed in the hearts of the elves, and in that very time, in the 3rd hour of morning, the trumpets of Maedhros were heard at last, coming up from the east, and the banners of the sons of Feanor assailed the enemy in the rear. Some have said that even then the Eldar might have won the day, had all their hosts proved faithful. For the orcs wavered, and their onslaught was stayed, and already some were turning to flight. But even as the vanguard of Maedhros came upon the orcs, Morgoth loosed his last strength, and Angband was emptied. There came wolves, and wolf riders, and there came Balrogs and dragons, and Glaurung, father of dragons. The strength and terror of the great worm were now great indeed, and elves and men withered before him, and he came between the hosts of Maedhros and Fingon, and swept them apart. Note that it's day 5 of the battle, before Maedhros joins in. I mean, what the hell was Uldor telling him? Well, it sounds like a massive fight is happening off to the west, but, Uldor has arranged this surprise birthday party. Who knows? But for a time, everything seems to be working out anyway. Fingon and Turgon and Maedhros have turned the tide. But here I feel like Morgoth was just toying with these guys. Because now he sends wolves, Balrogs, Glaurung, and notice how the quote reads, dragons and Glaurung. It does seem like there was never a scenario where the good guys could have won, even if everything had gone perfectly. And obviously this has been far from perfect. But as we near the end game of this battle, Tolkien informs us that Balrogs, dragons, and waves of orcs aside, it's the humans that win the day for the bad guys. Yet neither by wolf, nor by Balrog, nor by dragon would Morgoth have achieved his end, but for the treachery of men. In this hour the plots of Ulfang were revealed. Many of the Easterlings turned and fled, their hearts being filled with lies and fear. But the sons of Ulfang went over suddenly to Morgoth, and drove in upon the rear of the sons of Feanor, and in the confusion that they wrought, they came near to the standard of Maedhros. They reaped not the reward that Morgoth promised them, for Maglor slew Uldor the Accursed, the leader in treason, and the sons of Bor slew Ulfast and Ulvarth, ere they themselves were slain. But new strength of evil men came up that Uldor had summoned and kept hidden in the eastern hills. And the host of Maedhros was assailed now on 3 sides, and it broke, and was scattered, and fled this way and that. Yet fate saved the sons of Feanor, and though all were wounded, none were slain. For they drew together, and gathering a remnant of the Noldor and the Naugrim about them, they hewed away out of the battle, and escaped far away towards Mount Dolmed in the east. Last of all the eastern force to stand firm were the dwarves of Belegost, and thus they won renown. For the Naugrim withstood fire more heartily than either elves or men, and it was their custom, moreover, to wear great masks in battle, hideous to look upon, and those stood them in good stead against the dragons. And but for them, Glaurung and his brood would have withered all that was left of the Noldor. But the Naugrim made a circle about him when he assailed them, and even his mighty armor was not full proof against the blows of their great axes. And when in his rage Glaurung turned and struck down Azagol, lord of Belegost, and crawled over him, with his last stroke Azagol drove a knife into his belly, and so wounded him that he fled the field, and the beasts of Angband in dismay followed after him. Then the dwarves raised up the body of Azagol and bore it away, and with slow steps they walked behind, singing a dirge in deep voices, as it were a funeral pomp in their country, and gave no heed more to their foes, and none dared to stay them. So the Easterlings switch sides mid-battle and crush Maedhros' army. But he and his brothers survive, and Maglor slays Uldor. And we see that the sons of Bor remain true to Maedhros and are tragically slain for their efforts. The dwarves of Belegost, with their fireproof armor, actually withstand the dragons. And in his death blow, Azagol, lord of Belegost, injures Glaurung to the point that he flees back to Angband. And then we have this powerful moment when the dwarves stop fighting, form a funeral procession off the battlefield for Azagol, and no one stops them. Don't blame them. And that's how the Eastern Front, under Maedhros, falls. The Western Front, under Fingon, is about to suffer an even more devastating loss. But now in the Western battle, Fingon and Turgon were assailed by a tide of foes thrice greater than all the force that was left to them. Gothmog, lord of Balrogs, high captain of Angband, was come, and he drove a dark wedge between the elven hosts, surrounding King Fingon, and thrusting Turgon and Húrin aside towards the fen of Serech. Then he turned upon Fingon, That was a grim meeting. At last Fingon stood alone, with his guard dead about him, and he fought with Gothmog until another Balrog came behind and cast a thong of fire about him. Then Gothmog hewed him with his black axe, and a white flame sprang up from the helm of Fingon as it was cloven. Thus fell the High King of the Noldor, and they beat him into the dust with their maces, and his banner, blue and silver, they trod into the mire of his blood. Fingon, the High King, is dead. The second High King killed by Gothmog, Fëanor being the first. Fingon's brother, Turgon, is now the High King of the Noldor. The field was lost, but still Húrin and Huor and the remnant of the House of Haldor stood firm with Turgon of Gondolin, and the hosts of Morgoth could not yet win the pass of Sirion. Then Húrin spoke to Turgon, saying, "Go now, Lord, for in you lives the last hope of the Eldar, and while Gondolin stands, Morgoth shall still know fear in his heart." But Turgon answered, "Not long now can Gondolin be hidden, and being discovered, it must fall." Then Huor spoke and said, "Yet if it stands but a little while, then out of your house shall come the hope of elves and men. This I say to you, Lord, with the eyes of death, though we part here forever, and I shall not look on your white walls again. From you and from me a new star shall arise. Farewell." And Maeglin, Turgon's sister son, who stood by, heard these words and did not forget them, but he said nothing. Then Turgon took the counsel of Húrin and Huor, and summoned all that remained of the host of Gondolin, and such of Fingon's people as could be gathered. He retreated towards the pass of Sirion. And his captains, Ecthelion and Glorfindel, guarded the flanks to right and left, so that none of the enemy should pass them by. But the men of Dorlomin held the rear guard, as Húrin and Huor desired, for they did not wish in their hearts to leave the Northlands. And if they could not win back their homes, there they would stand to the end. Thus was the treachery of Uldor redressed, and of all the deeds of war that the fathers of men wrought in behalf of the Eldar, the last stand of the men of Dorlomin is most renowned. So it was that Turgon fought his way southward, until coming behind the guard of Húrin and Huor, he passed down Sirion and escaped, and he vanished into the mountains and was hidden from the eyes of Morgoth. And so Uldor's treachery is contrasted with the heroism of Húrin and Huor. Men saved the day for the new High King of the Noldor. And that somewhat prophetic conversation that Turgon has with Huor refers to the fact that Huor's son, Tuor, will one day marry Turgon's daughter, Idril, and their son, Eärendil, is going to save Middle-earth from Morgoth. And the importance of Maeglin overhearing that conversation, and apparently deciphering it, is that he wants to marry Idril himself. And so he sees that he's not in the plans. He's going to eventually betray the secret location of Gondolin to Morgoth. So now Turgon has fled the field, and Húrin and Huor make their hopelessly valiant last stand to cover the elves' escape. And boy is it violent. But the brothers drew the remnant of the men of the House of Hador about them, and foot by foot they withdrew, until they came behind the fen of Serech, and had the stream of Rivil before them. There they stood, and gave way no more. Then all the hosts of Angband swarmed against them, and they bridged the stream with their dead, and encircled the remnant of Hithlum as a gathering tide about a rock. There as the sun westered on the 6th day, and the shadow of Ered-Wethrin grew dark, Huor fell, pierced with a venomed arrow in his eye, and all the valiant men of Hador were slain about him in a heap, and the orcs hewed their heads and piled them as a mound of gold in the sunset. Last of all, Húrin stood alone. Then he cast aside his shield, and wielded an axe two-handed, and it is sung that the axe smoked in the black blood of the troll guard of Gothmog until it withered, and each time that he slew, Húrin cried, "Day shall come again." 70 times he uttered that cry, but they took him at last alive by the command of Morgoth, for the orcs grappled him with their hands, which clung to him even though he hewed off their arms. and ever their numbers were renewed, until at last he fell, buried beneath them. Then Gothmog bound him, and dragged him to Angband with mockery. And so, on day 6, Húrin and the men of Hador are slain. And after being a one-man wrecking crew, Húrin is captured. More on him in a second. His fate is actually much, much worse than death. And so the battle is over. And if the good guys thought they suffered during the Battle of Sudden Flame, they fared no better in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. Thus ended Nirnaeth Arnoediad, as the sun went down beyond the sea. Night fell in Hithlum, and there came a great storm of wind out of the west. Great was the triumph of Morgoth, and his design was accomplished in a manner after his own heart. For men took the lives of men, and betrayed the Eldar, and fear and hatred were aroused among those who should have been united against him. From that day, the hearts of elves were estranged from men, save only those of the 3 houses of the Edain. The realm of Fingon was no more, and the sons of Feanor wandered as leaves before the wind. Their arms were scattered, and their league broken, and they took to a wild and woodland life beneath the feet of arid Linden, mingling with the green elves of Beleriand, bereft of their power and glory of old. In Betrayal, some few of the Halidin yet dwelt in the protection of their woods, but to Hithlum came back never one of Fingon's host, nor any of the men of Hador's house, nor any tidings of the battle and the fate of their lords. But Morgoth sent thither the Easterlings that had served him, denying them the rich lands of Beleriand which they coveted, and he shut them in Hithlum, and forbade them to leave it. Such was the reward he gave them for their treachery to Maedhros, to plunder and harass the old and the women and the children of Hador's people. The remnant of the Eldar of Hithlum were taken to the mines of the north, and labored there as thralls, save some that eluded him and escaped into the wilds and the mountains. The army of Fingon is gone. The army of Maedhros is gone. The rest of the elves of Hithlum are taken to work in the mines. There is no silver lining, no moral victory that the elves can claim. This is a dark time, and it's going to get darker. Here's a reference to what becomes an infamous hill in Beleriand. By the command of Morgoth, the orcs, with great labor, gathered all the bodies of those who had fallen in the great battle, and all their harness and weapons, and piled them in a great mound in the midst of Anfauglith. And it was like a hill that could be seen from afar. The Hill of the Slain, the elves named it, and Houth and Nirnaeth, the Hill of Tears. But grass came there and grew again, long and green upon that hill, alone, in all the desert that Morgoth made. And no creature of Morgoth trod thereafter upon the earth beneath which the swords of the Eldar and the Edain crumbled into rust. Just to point out, Anfauglith used to be Ard Gallon, a rich green grassland. But in the Battle of Sudden Flame, the area was turned to ash, much like the desolation of Smaug at Erebor. And so, in the midst of this ashen wasteland, this mound of bodies becomes the only patch of grass in the region, and the orcs refuse to touch it. And that's the lingering monument to the disaster of the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. Now, the 6th and last battle of the Wars of Beleriand, the War of Wrath, takes place about 75 years after the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. But much like in my previous videos, there are some notable conflicts prior to the War of Wrath that don't rise to numbered status, although they are quite pivotal. I'm going to quickly mention 3 such conflicts. Battle 5.1 happens almost immediately after the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, and it's the destruction of Círdan's realm, the Fallas. But in the next year, ere the winter was come, Morgoth sent great strength, and ravaged all the Fallas, and besieged the walls of Brythumbar and Eglorest. Smiths and miners and masters of fire they brought with them, and they set up great engines, and valiantly though they were resisted, they broke the walls at last. Then the havens were laid in ruin, and the most part of Círdan's people were slain or enslaved, but some went aboard ship and escaped by sea. And among them was Erennion, Gil-galad, the son of Fingon, whom his father had sent to the havens after the Dagger Bragalach. This remnant sailed with Círdan south to the Isle of Balar, and they made a refuge for all that could come thither. Harrowing stuff for the elves at the havens, but Gil-galad and Círdan are able to escape by sea. At the moment, Turgon is still High King of the Noldor, but that title is going to pass to Gil-galad in the near future. An interesting note about that passage, note how Morgoth's army uses siege weapons. Smiths and miners and masters of fire they brought with them, and they set up great engines. It brings up the point of, hey, if siege weapons were around at this time, why didn't the elves use them against Angband? One answer is, perhaps the elves didn't have that tech. But I think that between the Noldor and their friends the dwarves, they should have come up with some siege technology during the 400-year siege of Angband. Another answer might be that Tolkien equates siege tech with the bad guys, almost like it's cheating. In any event, Morgoth has discovered enhanced warfare techniques, and he's got the elves on the run. There are two hidden realms that he's searching for, Nargothrond and Gondolin. He finds Nargothrond first, and in 495 of the First Age, a little over 20 years after Battle Number 5, we get Battle 5.2 in a field near Nargothrond's gate, the Battle of Tumhalad. It's a rout, compliments of Glaurung, and it spells the end for Nargothrond and the incredibly unlucky Gwyndor, who somehow survived the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, endured captivity, finally returned to Nargothrond, only to meet his end in yet another one-sided battle. Silmarillion, Chapter 21. Then the warriors of Nargothrond went forth, and tall and terrible on that day looked Húrin, and the heart of the host was upheld, as he rode on the right hand of Orodreth. But greater far was the host of Morgoth than any scouts had told, and none but Turin, defended by his dwarf mask, could withstand the approach of Glaurung. And the elves were driven back and pressed by the orcs into the field of Tumhalad, and there they were penned. On that day all the pride and host of Nargothrond withered away, and Orodreth was slain in the forefront of the battle, and Gwyndor, son of Gwilyn, was wounded to the death. Nargothrond is overthrown, yet another realm destroyed. A few years later, Doriath falls, not to Morgoth, but to a combination of dwarves and fellow elves. King Thingol is killed, his wife, Melian, leaves Middle-earth, and the protective barrier she provided leaves with her, leaving Doriath vulnerable. That leaves Gondolin as the last major elven stronghold. But for a while, its secret location holds. One person who knows where it is, because he lived there, is Húrin, currently a captive of Morgoth. He's the one who killed 70 orcs with his axe. So Morgoth tortures him for the information. Húrin refuses to give up Gondolin's location, and Morgoth responds by cursing him and his family, and forcing him to helplessly watch his family from afar endure tragedy after tragedy as the curse plays out. Húrin pays a terrible price, but he does hold out. Eventually, as I mentioned, it's the elf Maeglin who reveals Gondolin's location, and Morgoth zeroes in. This is from The Fall of Gondolin. At last, and Eärendil was then 7 years of age, Morgoth was ready, and he loosed upon Gondolin his orcs, and his balrogs, and his serpents. And of these, dragons of many and dire shapes were new devised for the taking of the city. The host of Morgoth came over the northern hills, where the height was greatest and the watch less vigilant. And it came at night, at a time of festival, when all the folk of Gondolin were upon the walls to wait upon the rising sun, and sing their songs at its uplifting. For the morrow was the feast, which they named the Gates of Summer. But the red light mounted the hills in the north, and not in the east. And there was no stay in the advance of the foe until they were beneath the very walls of Gondolin. And Gondolin was beleaguered without hope. Of the deeds of desperate valor there done, by the chieftains of the noble houses and their warriors, and not least by Tuor, is much told in the fall of Gondolin. Of the death of Rog without the walls, and of the battle of Ecthelion of the Fountain with Gothmog, Lord of Balrogs, in the very square of the king, where each slew the other, and of the defense of the tower of Turgon by the men of his household, until the tower was overthrown, and mighty was its fall, and the fall of Turgon in its ruin. Tolkien wrote a lot about the fall of Gondolin, and it probably deserves its own number, but for our purposes, it's Battle 5.3. Turgon is killed, leaving Gil-galad as the new king. But young Eärendil, only 7 years old, is saved by his parents, and that eventually proves to be Morgoth's undoing. I'll tell that story, the War of Wrath, next time. Thanks, everybody.